The first time Trace Porter saw her, she was bound in chains at the back of a covered wagon, her defiant emerald eyes meeting his through the dusty canvas flap, before disappearing into the fading light of the Arizona Territory sunset. The year was 1876, and Trace had been riding the dusty trails of the frontier for so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to call any place home. At 32, his weathered face told the story of a man who'd seen too much too young the war between the states had claimed his youth, and the lawless frontier had hardened whatever remained of his innocence. But something about those fleeting green eyes had stirred something in him he thought long dead. The wagon had been part of a small caravan making its way toward Copper Canyon, a mining settlement that had sprung up almost overnight after a significant copper vein had been discovered in the nearby mountains. Trace had been tracking the group for the better part of 2 days, initially curious about their heavily armed escorts, an unusual sight even for these dangerous parts. "Something ain't right about that outfit," he muttered to his dun-colored stallion, Rusty, as they maintained their distance on a ridge overlooking the narrow canyon pass. Through his field glasses, he counted 4 armed men riding alongside the 2 wagons. The lead wagon carried supplies, but it was the second that had caught his attention when the canvas had briefly shifted in the wind, revealing the woman inside. The caravan made camp as the sun dipped below the horizon, and Trace settled in to watch from his vantage point. The temperature dropped quickly, as desert nights often did, but he remained still, conserving his water and chewing on a piece of jerky as he observed the camp below. The armed men moved with military precision, setting a watch rotation that spoke of experience. 2 of them unloaded a wooden cage from the second wagon and transferred the woman into it, her wrists and ankles still bound. The sight made his blood boil. Human trafficking wasn't uncommon in these lawless territories. Mining towns with their abundance of lonely men created a market for women that unscrupulous traders were all too happy to fill. Some women came willingly, lured by promises of marriage or employment, only to find themselves forced into prostitution. Others were simply taken. Trace had seen it before but had always ridden on, telling himself it wasn't his fight. This time, something was different. Perhaps it was the woman's fierce gaze, or maybe he was just tired of turning away from the darkness that seemed to follow civilization wherever it spread across the frontier. When the camp settled and only 1 guard remained awake, Trace made his move. He left Rusty secured at a safe distance and approached on foot, his Colt Navy revolver holstered but ready. Years of moving through enemy territory during the war had taught him how to be a ghost, and the guard never heard him coming. A quick blow to the head with the butt of his revolver, and the man crumpled without a sound. Trace froze, listening for any sign that the others had been disturbed, but the camp remained silent except for the soft snoring of the sleeping men. He moved quickly to the cage, where the woman watched him with those same defiant green eyes he'd glimpsed earlier. "Who are you?" She whispered, her voice hoarse but strong. "Name's Trace Porter," he answered quietly, examining the lock on the cage. "And I reckon you'd rather not be wherever they're taking you." "Prudence Wilson," she replied, a slight tremor betraying her otherwise composed demeanor. "And you're right about that." Her auburn hair fell in tangled waves around a face that, despite the dirt and exhaustion, was striking in its determined beauty. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, dressed in a once fine traveling dress now torn and soiled from her captivity. Trace worked at the lock with the small set of picks he carried for such occasions, another skill acquired during the war. "How'd you end up with this charming company?" "They attacked my stagecoach 3 days ago," she explained, keeping her voice low. "Killed the driver and the guard. There was another woman, but they took her somewhere else." Her voice caught. "They said I'd fetch a good price at auction in Copper Canyon." The lock gave way with a soft click, and Trace opened the cage door. "Well, Miss Wilson, I believe that auction's been canceled." He quickly set to work on the shackles binding her wrists and ankles. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, watching his face carefully in the moonlight. Trace paused, realizing he didn't have a good answer. Maybe I'm just tired of watching bad men get their way, he finally said, returning to his task. When the last shackle fell away, Prudence rubbed her raw wrists and took a deep breath, as if tasting freedom for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered. "Save your thanks until we're clear of here," Trace cautioned, helping her out of the cage. "Can you walk?" She nodded, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. "Just try and stop me." They moved silently through the camp, but as they neared the perimeter, one of the sleeping men stirred and opened his eyes. Before he could shout, Prudence grabbed a nearby cooking pot and brought it down hard on his head. The man collapsed back onto his bedroll, unconscious. Trace raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Nice swing." "I have 3 brothers," she explained with the ghost of a smile. "You learn to defend yourself." They reached Rusty without further incident, and Trace helped Prudence onto the saddle before mounting behind her. The horse snorted in protest at the double burden, but responded to Trace's gentle urging, carrying them away from the camp at a careful walk until they were far enough away to risk a faster pace. "Where are you from, Miss Wilson?" Trace asked as they rode through the night, keeping to the shadowed canyons to avoid leaving an obvious trail. "St. Louis originally," she answered, her back stiff against his chest. "I was traveling to Tucson to take a teaching position. My father passed last winter and there wasn't much keeping me in Missouri anymore." Trace nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I'm sorry about your father. Mine died at Gettysburg. You fought in the war?" she asked. "Union cavalry," he confirmed. "Not much to be proud of there, but I did my duty." "As did they all," she said softly. "My eldest brother never came home from Shiloh." They fell into silence after that, the shared understanding of loss creating an unexpected connection between them. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the camp, but Trace knew the men would pursue them once they discovered their captive missing. "We need to find somewhere to rest and plan," he said, as the first light of day painted the eastern sky. "There's a small settlement about 10 miles ahead, Bitter Springs. Not much more than a trading post and a few cabins, but it's off the main trails." Prudence nodded, fatigue evident in the slump of her shoulders. "Will they have a telegraph?" "I should contact the school in Tuxen, let them know what's happened." "No telegraph," Trace replied, "but there might be someone heading that way who could carry a message." They reached Bitter Springs mid-morning, the small collection of buildings nestled against a rocky hillside surrounding a natural spring that gave the settlement its name. A weathered sign hung from the trading post porch, creaking slightly in the warm breeze. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Silas Jenkins, greeted them with suspicion until Trace spun a tale about being newlyweds whose wagon had been robbed, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and his horse. "Got a small room behind the store you can use for a day or two," Jenkins offered after hearing their story. "Not much, but it's clean, and the missus keeps it ready for travelers." "Much obliged," Trace said, handing over a few coins. "Any chance of getting some fresh clothes for my wife?" "And maybe a hot meal," Jenkins nodded. "Missus can help with that. She's over at the spring doing washing now." Trace turned to Prudence, who had remained silent during the exchange. "Why don't you go with Mrs. Jenkins and get cleaned up? I'll take care of Rusty and meet you back here." Prudence hesitated, uncertainty flashing across her face. "Are you sure that's wise? What if those men track us here?" "They won't be looking for a married couple," Trace assured her. "And I'll keep watch. Go on now, you'll feel better after a wash and some fresh clothes." As Prudence walked toward the spring where Mrs. Jenkins was working, Trace led Rusty to the small stable behind the trading post. As he removed the saddle and began brushing down the tired horse, he found himself watching Prudence's retreating figure. "What exactly are you planning here, Porter?" He muttered to himself. The logical course of action would be to help her reach Tuxen safely and then be on his way. He had no business getting involved beyond that, and yet something about Prudence Wilson made him reluctant to simply deliver her to her destination and ride away. He finished caring for Rusty and made his way back to the trading post where Jenkins was sorting through a newly arrived shipment of supplies. "Your wife seems like a fine lady," Jenkins commented. "Bit too fine for these parts, if you don't mind my saying." She's tougher than she looks, Trace replied, thinking of how she'd handled herself during their escape. Jenkins nodded. Need to be out here. Arizona territory ain't kind to the soft-hearted. He paused, studying Trace more carefully. You got the look of a man who's been riding alone a long time. That obvious, is it? Trace asked with a wry smile. To an old-timer like me, yeah. Jenkins pushed a tin cup of coffee across the counter. Been running this post for 15 years. You learn to read folks. Trace accepted the coffee gratefully. We're just passing through, hoping to reach Tuxen in a few days. Tuxen's growing fast, Jenkins observed. Lot of opportunities there for a man willing to work. The conversation was interrupted by Prudence's return. She'd washed the dirt from her face and hands, and Mrs. Jenkins had provided her with a simple blue calico dress that, while obviously secondhand, was clean and fit well enough. Her damp auburn hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and without the layer of trail dust, her skin had a healthy glow that accentuated her fine features. Trace found himself momentarily speechless, struck by how different she looked from the desperate captive he'd rescued just hours before. Feel better? He finally asked, finding his voice. Immeasurably, she replied with a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time since he'd met her. Mrs. Jenkins has been wonderfully kind. The older woman bustled in behind Prudence, carrying a bundle of clothing. Found some things that should fit you, she said, handing the bundle to Trace. And there's stew cooking for dinner. You both look like you could use a proper meal. They were shown to the small room behind the store, a modest space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. Prudence stood awkwardly in the center of the room, looking anywhere but at the bed. I'll sleep on the floor, Trace said quickly, setting down their meager belongings. You take the bed. Thank you, she replied, relief evident in her voice, for everything. I don't know what would have happened if, she broke off, unable to finish the thought. Don't think about it, Trace advised. You're safe now. For the moment, she corrected him. But those men won't simply give up, will they? Trace considered lying to ease her fears but decided against it. She deserved the truth. No, they won't, not with what they think they'll get for you at auction. Prudence shuddered but squared her shoulders. Then we need a plan. How far is Tuxen from here? About 4 days' ride if we push hard, Trace calculated, but they'll be watching the main trails. Then we don't take the main trails, she stated simply. Trace couldn't help but smile at her directness. No, madam, we don't, but the back country is rough going. Are you sure you're up for it, mister? Porter, she said with quiet dignity, I've already survived being kidnapped, bound, and caged like an animal. I believe I can manage a difficult ride. Her resilience impressed him, and he nodded in acknowledgement. We'll rest here today and tonight, then leave before dawn tomorrow. The men looking for you will expect us to keep moving, so staying put for a day might throw them off our trail. They shared a simple but nourishing meal with the Jenkins family that evening, maintaining their pretense as a married couple. Prudence played her part well, occasionally placing her hand on Trace's arm or smiling at him with practiced affection that, despite its artifice, sent an unexpected warmth through him. After dinner, they retired to their small room, the awkwardness returning as they prepared for sleep. Trace arranged his bedroll on the floor while Prudence sat perched on the edge of the bed, twisting her hands in her lap. Mr. Porter, she began hesitantly. Trace, he corrected her. If we're supposed to be married, you might as well use my given name. Trace, she amended with a small smile. I realize I know very little about you, yet I've placed my life entirely in your hands. Not much to tell, he said, settling onto his makeshift bed. Grew up in Pennsylvania, fought in the war, been drifting ever since. Worked as a scout for the army for a while, did some bounty hunting, ranch work, whatever paid enough to keep moving. And what were you doing in the middle of nowhere when you found me? She asked. Trace was silent for a moment. I was tracking a man, he finally admitted. Goes by the name of Wesley Hardin. He killed a friend of mine in El Paso last month. I've been on his trail ever since. You're a bounty hunter then, not officially. This is personal. He looked up at her, seeing concern in her eyes. Don't worry, I've set that aside for now. Getting you to Tuxen safely is what matters. Why? She pressed. Why does my safety matter to a stranger with his own mission? It was a fair question, and one Trace wasn't entirely sure he could answer. I've seen too many good people suffer in this life, he said slowly. Done too much looking the other way. Maybe I'm trying to balance the scales a bit. Prudence seemed to consider this. My father used to say that a person's character is revealed not by grand gestures, but by the small choices they make when no one is watching. She smiled softly. I think he would have approved of you, Trace Porter. The simple compliment affected him more than he cared to admit. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, she agreed, a shadow of grief passing over her face, a professor of literature at Washington University. He taught me to love books, ideas, to believe in the inherent goodness of people. She laughed without humor. Recent events have tested that particular lesson. Don't let them take that from you, Trace said with unexpected intensity. That belief it's worth holding on to. Their eyes met in the dim light of the oil lamp, and something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different paths. Prudence was the first to look away, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of their conversation. We should rest, she said, lying down on the bed and pulling the thin blanket over herself. Tomorrow will be a long day. Trace extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Good night, Prudence. Good night, Trace, she replied softly. Sleep came quickly to Prudence, her exhaustion finally claiming her. But Trace remained awake, listening to her steady breathing and pondering the strange turn his life had taken. He'd been so focused on tracking Hardin, on avenging his friend's death, that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to protect rather than hunt. There was a peace in it he hadn't expected. Eventually, he too drifted off, his hand resting on the revolver beside him, ever vigilant even in sleep. They left Bitter Springs before dawn as planned, with fresh supplies provided by the Jenkins family. Mrs. Jenkins had packed them food for several days, and Silas had given Trace detailed directions for the back trails to Tuxen. Stick to the high country, the old man had advised. Harder going, but fewer folks to notice you. There's a missionary station about 2 days' ride from here, San Xavier. Father Rodriguez there is a good man, he'll help you if you need it. Trace had thanked him, pressing a few extra coins into his hand. For your kindness, he'd explained when Jenkins tried to refuse. The first day of travel was uneventful as they climbed into the higher elevations, the desert landscape giving way to scattered juniper and pinyon pine. Rusty handled the double burden admirably, though Trace frequently dismounted to lead the horse up particularly steep sections. Prudence proved as resilient as she'd claimed, never complaining despite the obvious discomfort of the hard ride. She asked thoughtful questions about the territory, listening attentively as Trace explained the natural features and potential dangers. How did you learn so much about this land? She asked as they stopped to rest in the shade of a large boulder. Army scouting, he replied, offering her the canteen. Spent 3 years after the war guiding cavalry patrols through Apache territory. You learn the land or you die out here. The Apaches, she said, a hint of concern in her voice. Should we be worried about them? Most of the tribes are on reservations now, Trace explained. The ones that aren't tend to avoid small parties like us unless provoked. They've got bigger problems than 2 travelers passing through. You sound almost sympathetic to them, she observed. Trace shrugged. I've seen enough of war to understand fighting for your home. He took the canteen back, their fingers brushing momentarily. Besides, in my experience, Indians are no more inherently good or bad than white folks, just people trying to survive. They camped that night in a small box canyon that offered protection from the wind and prying eyes. Trace built a small fire, keeping it low to minimize the chance of the smoke being spotted, and they shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. Tell me about Tuxen, Trace said as they sat by the fire. What's waiting for you there? A position at the territorial school, Prudence explained, teaching reading and arithmetic to children. After Father died, there wasn't much keeping me in St. Louis. My brothers are all married with families of their own, and she hesitated. I needed a fresh start. No husband waiting somewhere, Trace asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. Forgive me, that's none of my business. No, it's all right, she assured him. There was someone once, Robert Chamberlain. We were engaged before the war. Her expression grew distant. He came back changed, like so many did. The man I loved never really returned from the battlefield. Trace nodded in understanding. War has a way of hollowing a man out. Yes, she agreed sadly. We tried for a year after he returned, but in the end, we both knew it wouldn't work. He went west to California, I believe, and I stayed to care for my father. She looked up at Trace. And what about you? Is there someone waiting for you somewhere? He shook his head. No, never stayed in one place long enough for that. By choice? She asked perceptively. Maybe at first, he admitted. After the war, I couldn't settle, couldn't sleep without seeing. He trailed off, the memories too dark to share. So I kept moving. After a while, it became a habit, I suppose. And this friend you're avenging, she prompted gently. Jake Sinclair, Trace said, the name still bringing a pang of grief. We served together, saved each other's lives more times than I can count. After the war, he settled in El Paso, started a freight business. I'd stop by whenever I was passing through. He poked at the fire, sending sparks into the night air. Last month, Hardin killed him over a gambling debt that wasn't even real, just looking for an excuse to draw on someone with a reputation. I'm sorry, Prudence said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. Jake had a wife, a little boy, Trace continued, unable to stop now that he'd started. They're staying with her sister now, but that boy will grow up without a father because some killer wanted to prove he was faster. Prudence moved to sit beside him, her shoulder touching his in silent support. And when you find this Hardin, what then? I don't know, Trace admitted. I've been so focused on tracking him, I haven't thought much beyond that. He looked at her profile in the firelight. What would your father, the professor, say about vengeance? He would quote Shakespeare, most likely, she said with a small smile. In seeking to revenge, we often perpetuate the cycle of pain. She turned to face him fully. But he would also understand that justice matters, that good men can't stand aside while evil men prosper. They sat in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned low. When it was time to sleep, Trace insisted on taking the first watch, and Prudence didn't argue, wrapping herself in a blanket near the dying embers. Wake me for the second watch, she said. I can handle a gun if needed. Trace raised an eyebrow in surprise. 3 brothers, remember, she said with a tired smile. And a father who believed women should be able to defend themselves. I'll remember that, Trace promised, settling himself against a boulder with a clear view of the canyon entrance. The night passed without incident, and they were on the move again at first light. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they navigated narrow trails that switchbacked up steep inclines. By midday, they had reached a high plateau that offered a commanding view of the surrounding country. Trace reined in Rusty and studied the landscape through his field glasses, methodically scanning for any sign of pursuit. He spotted a dust cloud far to the east, moving roughly parallel to their path but on the main trail below. Riders, he informed Prudence, handing her the glasses. Could be our friends, could be just travelers. Either way, we're better off up here. She peered through the glasses, her expression grim. 5 men, could that be them? Possibly, Trace acknowledged. We won't know for sure unless they start climbing up this way. For now, we keep moving and stay alert. They continued westward across the plateau, making good time on the relatively flat terrain. As the afternoon wore on, the distant riders disappeared from view, but Trace remained cautious, frequently checking their back trail. The sun was low on the horizon when they came upon a small stream cutting across their path. They stopped to refill their canteens and let Rusty drink, both grateful for the cool water after hours in the saddle. How much farther to this mission? Prudence asked, splashing water on her face. Should reach it by tomorrow afternoon if we keep up this pace, Trace replied, scanning the area for a suitable campsite. From there, it's another day and a half to Tuxen. He helped her remount, noticing the stiffness in her movements. Saddle sore? He asked sympathetically. A bit, she admitted with a rueful smile. But I'll manage. They found a sheltered spot among a stand of pines and made camp as darkness fell. This time they risked no fire, sharing a cold supper of jerky and hardtack. The night was colder at this elevation, and Prudence shivered despite her blanket. "Here," Trace said, removing his coat and draping it over her shoulders. "This should help." "But you'll be cold," she protested. "I've slept in worse conditions," he assured her. "Besides, I'll be moving around on watch." She accepted the coat gratefully, pulling it tightly around herself. "Thank you, you're a good man, Trace Porter." The simple statement caught him off guard. "I don't know about that." "I do," she said with quiet certainty. "A good man who's perhaps lost his way a bit, but good nonetheless." Her faith in him was both comforting and unsettling. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him and seen something more than a drifter with a gun. "Get some rest," he said gruffly, turning away to hide the emotion her words had stirred. "I'll wake you for your watch." Later, as Prudence slept wrapped in his coat, Trace found himself watching her more than the surrounding darkness. In sleep, the worry lines smoothed from her face, making her look younger and more vulnerable. A protective instinct surged through him, stronger than anything he'd felt in years. "You're getting soft, Porter," he muttered to himself, forcing his attention back to the perimeter of their camp. He woke her for the second watch as promised, though he found it difficult to sleep knowing she was standing guard alone. Every sound brought him to alertness, his hand moving to his revolver before he was fully awake. Eventually, he gave up on sleep entirely and joined her where she sat on a fallen log at the edge of their campsite. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, making room for him. "Too many years of keeping one eye open," he explained. "Becomes a habit, like moving from place to place." She asked, a gentle challenge in her voice. "Something like that," he agreed, recognizing the parallel she was drawing. "What will you do after?" she asked after a moment of silence. "After you find Hardin, after you get me to Tuxen?" Trace hadn't considered the question before. "Keep moving, I suppose. It's what I know." "Is it what you want?" she pressed. "What I want stopped mattering a long time ago," he said, more sharply than he'd intended. Prudence wasn't deterred by his tone. "Perhaps it's time it started mattering again." Before he could respond, a distant sound caught his attention, the faint whinny of a horse carried on the night breeze. He held up a hand for silence, straining to hear. "Someone's out there," he whispered, reaching for his rifle. "Get your things together quietly, we need to move." They packed quickly in the darkness, working by touch more than sight. Trace saddled Rusty, keeping the horse calm with soothing whispers as he tightened the cinch. When they were ready, he helped Prudence into the saddle and led the horse deeper into the pine forest, away from the direction of the sound. They traveled through the night, moving slowly to avoid making noise that might give away their position. The dense forest canopy blocked most of the moonlight, forcing them to trust Rusty's sure-footedness on the unfamiliar terrain. By dawn, they had put several miles between themselves and their abandoned campsite, but Trace remained tense, constantly checking for signs of pursuit. As the first light filtered through the trees, he found a vantage point that allowed him to survey their back trail. Through his field glasses, he could make out 3 riders in the distance, methodically quartering the area where they had camped. "They're tracking us," he informed Prudence, his expression grim, "and they're good at it." "How far to the mission?" she asked, fatigue evident in her voice but determination in her eyes. "Still a good day's ride," Trace calculated, "and we can't take the direct route now." "What do we do?" Trace considered their options. "We need to split up," he finally said. "I'll leave a false trail leading north while you continue west toward the mission. It should buy you enough time to reach Father Rodriguez." "No," Prudence said firmly. "I won't leave you to face them alone." "This isn't up for debate," Trace insisted. "You hired me to get you to Tuxen safely, and that's what I intend to do." Her eyes flashed with anger. "I didn't hire you at all, if you'll recall. You chose to help me, and I'm choosing not to abandon you now." "It's not abandonment, it's strategy," he argued. "One rider will move faster and leave less of a trail, and I can handle myself if they catch up to me." "So can I," she countered. "Or have you forgotten that I've been an active participant in this escape so far?" Trace ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Prudence, be reasonable. These men will kill me if they catch me, but they want you alive. That gives me an advantage you don't have. All the more reason we shouldn't separate, she insisted. Together, we have a better chance than either of us alone. They stared at each other, neither willing to yield, until Rusty snorted impatiently, breaking the tension. Fine, Trace conceded. Together, but we ride hard and we don't stop until we reach the mission. They pushed on through the day, alternating between fast trots where the terrain allowed and careful navigation of the more treacherous sections. Trace constantly checked their back trail, but there was no further sign of their pursuers, which only increased his unease. "They're still coming," he said during a brief stop to rest Rusty. "They're just being smarter about it now." By late afternoon, exhaustion was taking its toll on both of them. Prudence swayed in the saddle, and even Trace's iron discipline couldn't prevent his reactions from slowing. They had just crested a ridge when Rusty suddenly pricked his ears forward, alerting Trace to something ahead. Through a break in the trees, they could see a small valley below, and in its center, the white adobe walls of a building surrounded by cultivated fields. San Xavier Mission. "We made it," Prudence breathed, relief evident in her voice. "Not yet," Trace cautioned. "We're still exposed up here. Let's get down to the valley as quickly as we can." They had just started down the slope when a rifle shot cracked the air, sending splinters flying from a tree trunk beside them. Rusty reared in alarm, nearly unseating both riders. "Go," Trace shouted, digging his heels into the horse's flanks. Rusty responded instantly, plunging down the slope at a dangerous pace as more shots followed them. Trace twisted in the saddle, drawing his revolver and firing back blindly to discourage pursuit. He could see two riders emerging from the trees behind them, urging their horses down the steep incline. The mission was still a half-mile away across open ground when Rusty stumbled, throwing both riders forward. Trace managed to keep his seat and pulled hard on the reins to steady the horse, but Prudence slipped sideways. He grabbed for her, catching her arm and preventing her from falling completely, but the awkward movement threw them off balance. Rusty stumbled again on the uneven ground, and this time both riders tumbled from the saddle. They hit the ground hard, rolling several feet before coming to a stop. Trace recovered first, scrambling to his feet and reaching for Prudence, who lay motionless. "Prudence." He called urgently, fear gripping him at the sight of her still form. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, but to his immense relief, her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. "I'm all right," she gasped, though her pale face belied her words. "Just had the wind knocked out of me." Another shot kicked up dirt nearby, reminding them of the immediate danger. Rusty had continued down the slope and now stood nervously pawing the ground about 50 yards away. "Can you stand?" Trace asked, helping Prudence to a sitting position. "I think so," she said, grimacing as she tested her limbs. "Nothing seems broken." Trace helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she gained her balance. "We need to reach Rusty and get to the mission." They had taken only a few steps when more gunfire erupted, this time from a different direction. Trace pushed Prudence behind him, raising his revolver, but then realized the shots weren't aimed at them. Looking back up the slope, he saw their pursuers taking cover as bullets struck around them. From the direction of the mission, several riders were approaching at a gallop, rifles raised. Leading them was a man in the dark robes of a Catholic priest, a most incongruous sight with a Winchester rifle in his hands. "Father Rodriguez, I presume?" Trace said with a relieved laugh as the riders reached them. "Indeed," the priest confirmed, lowering his rifle. "And you appear to be in need of sanctuary, my children." "You could say that," Trace agreed, still supporting Prudence. "I'm Trace Porter and this is Prudence Wilson. Silas Jenkins from Bitter Springs said you might be willing to help us." "Any friend of Silas is welcome at San Xavier," Father Rodriguez said warmly. His dark eyes took in Prudence's condition with concern. "Your wife is injured. We should get her to the mission immediately." Trace didn't correct the misunderstanding, instead helping Prudence onto one of the spare horses the mission party had brought. "What about them?" he asked, nodding toward the men on the slope, who had retreated into the trees under the covering fire. They will not dare attack the mission, Father Rodriguez assured him. Even in these lawless territories, few men are willing to bring the wrath of the church upon themselves. Besides, he added with a grim smile, my congregation is well armed and practiced in defense. Trace retrieved Rusty, and the group rode quickly to the mission. The compound was larger than it had appeared from a distance, consisting of the main church building, several outbuildings, and a surrounding wall that gave it the appearance of a small fortress. They were met in the courtyard by a middle-aged woman who immediately took charge of Prudence, leading her away to be tended. Father Rodriguez showed Trace to a small room where he could wash and rest, promising to send food shortly. Your pursuers, the priest said as he turned to leave. They are slavers, human traffickers, Trace confirmed. They took Miss Wilson from a stagecoach and were planning to sell her at auction in Copper Canyon. Father Rodriguez crossed himself. Such evil thrives where law is distant. You did a righteous thing in rescuing her, my son. After the priest left, Trace washed away the dust and grime of their journey, wincing at the various bruises and scrapes he'd accumulated. His mind kept returning to the moment Prudence had fallen from the horse, the terror he'd felt seeing her lying motionless on the ground. It was a feeling he hadn't expected, one that went beyond the responsibility of a guide or protector. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A young Mexican boy entered with a tray of food and informed him in halting English that the señora was resting comfortably and would join him for the evening meal if she felt strong enough. Trace ate gratefully, realizing how hungry he was after the long day's ride. When he finished, he sought out Father Rodriguez, finding the priest in a small study adjacent to the church. "How is Miss Wilson?" he asked without preamble. "Resting," the priest replied. "The doctor says she has a mild concussion and some bruising, but no serious injuries. She is a strong woman." "That she is," Trace agreed. "Have there been any signs of those men?" "My men report they have withdrawn for now, but they are still in the area," Father Rodriguez said. "I believe they are waiting for an opportunity." "Then we shouldn't stay long," Trace decided. "As soon as Prudence is able to travel, we should continue to Tuxen. I can arrange an escort," the priest offered. "Several of my congregation make regular trips to Tuxen for supplies." "I'd appreciate that," Trace said. "The more guns, the better." Father Rodriguez studied him thoughtfully. "You care for her, this woman you rescued." It wasn't a question, and Trace didn't immediately deny it as he might have done days earlier. "She's different," he finally admitted. "Stronger than she knows, but still sees the good in people despite what she's been through." "And after Tuxen?" The priest asked. "What then?" "She has a position waiting at the territorial school," Trace explained, "and I have unfinished business elsewhere." "Ah," Father Rodriguez nodded in understanding. "The restless spirit moves on. But perhaps, my son, it is time to consider whether your path might lie in a different direction." Before Trace could respond, another knock came at the study door. It opened to reveal Prudence, her head bandaged but her color much improved. She wore a simple dress borrowed from one of the mission women, and her hair was neatly braided. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her eyes finding Trace's immediately. "Not at all, my child," Father Rodriguez assured her, rising from his chair. "I was just about to see to the evening prayers. Please make yourself comfortable." He nodded to them both and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. "How are you feeling?" Trace asked, moving to help Prudence to a chair. "Much better after some rest," she replied. "Though my head still aches a bit." "The doctor says you have a concussion," Trace told her. "You should take it easy for a day or two." "We don't have a day or two," she reminded him. "Those men are still out there." "Father Rodriguez has offered an escort to Tuxen when you're ready to travel," Trace explained. "We'll be safer in numbers." Prudence nodded, then winced at the movement. "Did I thank you for saving me again today?" "You don't need to thank me," Trace said, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." "No," she disagreed, reaching out to touch his hand. "Not anyone. Most men would have ridden on when they saw that wagon. Most men wouldn't risk their lives for a stranger." Her touch sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the desert heat. "Maybe I'm not as good a man as you think," he said, his voice rough. Maybe I have my own reasons. And what reasons would those be? She asked softly. Trace looked at their joined hands, then up to her face, seeing something in her eyes that both terrified and exhilarated him. I don't know, he admitted, but being with you these past few days, it's made me question things I thought I was certain about, such as whether vengeance is worth the cost, he said. Whether always moving on is really freedom or just another kind of prison. Prudence's grip on his hand tightened. And have you found answers? Not yet, he said honestly, but I'm starting to see possibilities I couldn't see before. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Prudence was the first to break the connection, gently withdrawing her hand. Father Rodriguez believes we're married, she said with a small smile. I didn't correct him. Neither did I, Trace admitted. It seemed simpler. Yes, she agreed. Simpler. They spent the evening in the mission's common room, sharing a meal with Father Rodriguez and several members of his congregation. The priest was a natural storyteller, regaling them with tales of the mission's founding and the various characters who had passed through over the years. When it was time to retire, they were shown to a small guest room with a single bed. Once again, Trace insisted on sleeping on the floor despite Prudence's protests. You're injured, he reminded her. You need proper rest, and you don't, she challenged. I've slept on worse than a wooden floor, he assured her. She relented eventually, but as she settled onto the bed, she said, In Tucson, I'll insist on proper accommodations for you. No more floors or bedrolls. In Tucson, he repeated, the words carrying a finality that neither of them acknowledged. The next morning, Prudence felt well enough to travel, though the doctor advised against a long day in the saddle. Father Rodriguez arranged for a wagon to carry her, with Trace riding alongside and 4 armed men from the mission serving as escorts. The men who pursue you were seen leaving the area early this morning, the priest informed them as they prepared to depart. But that does not mean the danger has passed. Remain vigilant. We will, Father, Trace assured him, and thank you for your hospitality. Go with God, my children, Father Rodriguez blessed them, making the sign of the cross as they departed. The journey to Tuxen was uneventful, the presence of their armed escort apparently deterring any further pursuit. They traveled at a steady pace, stopping frequently to rest, and by late afternoon of the second day, they crested a rise that offered their first view of Tuxen in the distance. The town was larger than Trace had expected, with adobe and wooden buildings spreading out from a central plaza. The territorial capital had grown significantly in recent years, attracting settlers and businesses as Arizona pushed for statehood. It's bigger than I imagined, Prudence said, echoing his thoughts. Growing fast, one of their escorts confirmed. The railroad's coming soon, too. They say it'll reach Tuxen by next year. They reached the outskirts of town as the sun was setting, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and rose. Their escort led them to a modest hotel near the plaza, where Trace secured 2 rooms for the night. After thanking the men from the mission and seeing them off with additional payment for their services, Trace helped Prudence into the hotel. The proprietor, a plump woman named Mrs. Hollister, took one look at Prudence's bandaged head and immediately fussed over her, insisting on sending up hot water and a tray of food. You poor dear, she clucked. Traveling in your condition, men have no consideration. She shot Trace a disapproving look. It wasn't his fault, Mrs. Hollister, Prudence quickly defended him. Mr. Porter has been most considerate. We had an accident on the trail. The woman's expression softened somewhat. Well, you need rest now. I'll send up that hot water right away. In the privacy of Prudence's room, they finally had a moment to consider their situation. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, but both felt strangely unsettled now that their journey was nearing its end. I should find the school administrator tomorrow, Prudence said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Let him know I've arrived. I'll accompany you, Trace offered, just to be sure you're settled safely. She nodded, then looked up at him with a question in her eyes. And after that? Trace moved to the window, looking out at the darkening streets of Tucson. I still have unfinished business, he said, his voice flat, Hardin, she said, the name hanging between them like a barrier. Yes. And if you find him, what then? Trace turned to face her. I don't know, he admitted. For so long, that's been my only purpose. I haven't thought beyond it. Perhaps it's time you did, she suggested gently. Before he could respond, a knock at the door announced the arrival of the hot water and food. Trace used the interruption to excuse himself, claiming fatigue and the need to check on their horses. I'll see you in the morning, he said, pausing at the door. Rest well, Prudence. Good night, Trace, she replied, her eyes following him as he left. Outside in the cooler air of the evening, Trace wandered the streets of Tucson, his mind in turmoil. The town was alive with activity. Saloons spilled light and music onto the streets. Merchants were closing up shops, and residents strolled the boardwalks enjoying the pleasant evening. He found himself outside a saloon called the Silver Dollar and stepped inside, ordering a whiskey at the bar. As he sipped the fiery liquid, he studied the wanted posters tacked to the wall behind the bartender. Hardin's face wasn't among them, looking for someone. The bartender asked, noticing his interest. Wesley Hardin, Trace replied. Heard he might be in these parts. The bartender shook his head. That snake, he was here about a month back, caused some trouble and moved on. Word is he headed for New Mexico territory. The news should have spurred Trace to action, renewed his determination to continue his pursuit. Instead, he felt an unexpected sense of relief. New Mexico was in the opposite direction from Tuxen from Prudence. He finished his drink and stepped back into the night, his steps taking him back toward the hotel. A decision was forming in his mind, one that both terrified and exhilarated him. The next morning, Trace escorted Prudence to the territorial school, a substantial brick building near the center of town. The administrator, Mr. Finch, was a balding man with spectacles and a formal manner who expressed relief at Prudence's arrival. We feared something had happened when you didn't arrive on schedule, Miss Wilson, he explained. The stagecoach company reported an attack, but they had no information on the passengers. I was fortunate that Mr. Porter came to my aid, Prudence said, casting a warm glance at Trace. Without his help, I would never have reached Tuxen. Mr. Finch adjusted his spectacles as he peered at Trace. Then we are in your debt, sir. The territorial school has been in desperate need of qualified teachers. Just doing what needed doing, Trace said uncomfortably. They discussed the details of Prudence's position, including her accommodations, a small house near the school that came with her teaching appointment, and when she would begin her duties. The school term begins in 2 weeks, Mr. Finch informed her. That should give you ample time to settle in and prepare your classroom. As they left the school building, Prudence turned to Trace with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. Well, it seems I'm officially a Tuxen schoolteacher now. It suits you, Trace said sincerely. Those children will be lucky to have you. They walked in silence for a moment before Prudence spoke again. I suppose this is where our paths diverge. Trace stopped walking, turning to face her directly. It doesn't have to be. Prudence's eyes widened in surprise. What do you mean? I've been thinking, Trace said, the words coming slowly as he formed thoughts he'd been considering all night. Hardin's headed for New Mexico, according to the bartender at the Silver Dollar. So you'll be leaving today, she concluded, her voice carefully neutral. No, he said firmly. I'm not going after him. Now Prudence looked truly shocked. But your friend, your vengeance, Jake, wouldn't want me to spend my life chasing his killer, Trace said, realizing the truth of it as he spoke. He'd want me to live, and these past few days with you. I've remembered what that feels like, to live, not just survive. Hope dawned in Prudence's eyes, but she remained cautious. What are you saying, Trace? I'm saying I'd like to stay, he said simply. In Tuxen, see what kind of life I might build here, and us, she asked softly. Trace took her hands in his heart pounding harder than it had in any gunfight. I know it's sudden. I know we've only known each other a short time, but these days with you have meant more to me than all the years before. I don't expect anything, Prudence. I just want the chance to see if what I feel, what I hope you might feel too, has a chance to grow into something real. Tears welled in Prudence's eyes, but her smile was radiant. I'd like that very much, she whispered. Relief and joy surged through Trace. Impulsively, he leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that she returned with equal tenderness. When they parted, both were smiling, slightly embarrassed by their public display but too happy to truly care. "Well, Miss Wilson," Trace said, offering her his arm. "Shall we go see this house of yours?" "We shall, Mr. Porter," she agreed, taking his arm. "And perhaps afterward you can tell me what skills besides tracking and shooting you might offer to the growing town of Tuxen." "I've been thinking about that too," Trace admitted as they walked through the sunlit streets. "The bartender mentioned the town needs a new deputy marshal. With my experience, I might qualify." "A lawman," Prudence mused, smiling up at him. "It suits you better than bounty hunting, I think." "A man who enforces the law rather than operating outside it," Trace agreed. Jake would approve of that too. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as both settled into their new lives in Tucson. Trace interviewed with the town marshal, a grizzled veteran named Frank Harker, who hired him on the spot after hearing of his military and scouting background. "Need men who can handle themselves," Harker had said bluntly. "And who understand this territory. Pay ain't much, but it's steady." Prudence threw herself into preparing for the new school term, organizing her classroom and developing lessons for students of varying ages and abilities. The small house provided by the school became a cozy home under her care, with simple furnishings acquired from local merchants. Trace took a room at a boarding house nearby, visiting Prudence daily but maintaining propriety as befitted a schoolteacher's reputation. Their relationship blossomed in the relative peace of Tuxen, each discovering new facets of the other's character away from the danger that had initially brought them together. They explored the growing town together in their free time, attending community gatherings and church services, gradually becoming part of the fabric of Tuxen society. Prudence's natural warmth and intelligence quickly won her friends among the town's women, while Trace's quiet competence earned him respect from its men. As the weeks turned to months, their feelings for each other deepened from the intense connection forged during their dangerous journey to a more steady, abiding love built on shared values and mutual respect. On a crisp autumn evening 6 months after their arrival in Tucson, Trace took Prudence for a ride into the desert hills outside town to watch the sunset. They sat together on a blanket, the vast Arizona sky painted in spectacular hues of orange and purple before them. "I have something for you," Trace said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Prudence's breath caught as she recognized what it might be. "Trace." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond. "It's not fancy," he apologized. "A lawman's salary only goes so far." "It's perfect," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Prudence Wilson," Trace said, taking her hand in his. "When I found you in that wagon, I was a man without direction, without purpose beyond vengeance. You showed me there could be more to life, that I could be more. Will you marry me and continue showing me the way forward every day for the rest of our lives?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, her smile radiant through her tears. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that conveyed all the love and promise of their future together. They were married that December in Tuxen's small church, with the entire community in attendance. Mrs. Hollister from the hotel cried openly during the ceremony, while Marshal Harker stood as Trace's best man, looking uncomfortable in his formal attire but proud nonetheless. Father Rodriguez made the journey from San Xavier Mission to perform the ceremony, his kind face beaming as he pronounced them husband and wife. Even Silas and Mrs. Jenkins traveled from Bitter Springs to share in the celebration, bringing news that the human traffickers who had kidnapped Prudence had finally been captured by the territorial authorities. "Seems they made the mistake of trying the same scheme in a town with a proper sheriff," Silas reported with satisfaction. "They'll be spending many years in Yuma prison now." The news brought a sense of closure to both Trace and Prudence, allowing them to fully embrace their new life together without the shadow of the past hanging over them. As they danced at their wedding celebration, Prudence leaned close to her new husband's ear. "Did you ever imagine when you found me in that wagon that we would end up here?" "Not in my wildest dreams," Trace admitted, holding her close. "But I thank God every day that I followed that caravan." "As do I," she said softly. "You freed me from more than just physical chains that day, Trace Porter. You freed my heart." "And you freed mine," he replied, kissing her gently, "from a prison of my own making." Their life together in Tuxen prospered as the territory grew. Trace eventually became town marshal when Harker retired, bringing law and order to the community with a firm but fair hand. Prudence continued teaching, becoming headmistress of the territorial school as it expanded to accommodate the growing population. 2 years after their wedding, they welcomed their first child, a son they named Lucas James Porter, the middle name a tribute to Trace's fallen friend. 3 years later, a daughter joined their family, Lillian Grace Porter, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's determined spirit. The railroad reached Tucson as predicted, bringing new opportunities and growth to the town. Trace and Prudence invested wisely in land and businesses, building a comfortable life for their family while remaining dedicated to serving their community. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they returned to the desert hillside where Trace had proposed. The sunset was just as spectacular, painting the sky in brilliant colors as they sat together, older now but still very much in love. "Do you ever regret it?" Prudence asked, resting her head on his shoulder. "Not pursuing Hardin. I heard he was finally captured in El Paso last year." "Not for a moment," Trace replied honestly. "Jake's death will always pain me, but vengeance wouldn't have brought him back. And it would have cost me everything I've found with you." He looked down at their intertwined hands, the gold of their wedding bands catching the last light of day. 10 years ago, I was a man with nothing but a gun and a grudge. Now I have a purpose, a community, children to raise, and a woman I love more with each passing day." Prudence smiled up at him, the years having only enhanced her beauty in his eyes. "And I was a woman in chains, destined for a life of misery until a good man decided to take a stand." "Funny how fate works," Trace mused, pulling her closer as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "All because I happened to spot a covered wagon on a dusty trail." "Not fate," Prudence corrected him gently. "Choice. You chose to help a stranger when most would have ridden on. I chose to trust you when I had every reason not to, and we both chose to believe in the possibility of love when it seemed most unlikely." "Best choice I ever made," Trace said softly, kissing her as the desert night enfolded them in its peaceful embrace. As they rode back to town, to the home and family they had built together, both reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point, from a chance encounter on a dangerous frontier to a life rich with purpose, community, and abiding love. A journey that had begun with a captive woman bound for auction and a restless man seeking vengeance, and had transformed them both into something neither could have imagined. A family rooted and flourishing in the once wild West.